All right, thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to wait just a few minutes to get started as we have some people logging on. We'll begin in 2 minutes. Okay, everyone, I have 2 minutes past the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. I know there will be some folks still logging into the session here, but we are recording this, so if there is something that you've missed, you'll be able to go back and replay it. My name is Jim Rogers. I'm the Chief Strategic Officer for Dawood Engineering. We welcome you to the second in our summer series of webinars. This particular session will be focused on municipal funding. We'll be leading a panel discussion, and I'll just go through a few logistics here before we get started with the discussion. We will be going through a series of questions with each member of the panelists, and also we'll have the Q&A function, which you may enter questions into at any time during this discussion. We'll be happy to have you share your questions with us. We want this to be an informative conversation, and we'll go through all of those questions at the end of the session. So please, if you are able to come up with a question, we'd like you to share it with us, and we'll also be sharing our contact information at the end of the session if you'd like to reach out to us privately. So I'd like to introduce the members of our panel. We have several folks that are joining us today from amongst our team. We have John Miserak, our Director of Planning and Economic Development, Jesse Suiters, our Manager of Planning and Economic Development, and John Pasula, the Regional Manager of our Civil Engineering team in our Canonsburg, Pennsylvania office. So we'll be going through a series of questions with each of them, and when we cycle back to all of you, we'll also be going through the questions that you provide to us. So with that, I'd like to begin with a question for John Miserak. John, we're in a historic period of public funding here where we are talking about the discussion of available funds. We've got the typical cycle of funding, and we've also got an ongoing nationwide crisis associated with this. Why is this discussion about municipal funding so important right now?
Thank you, Jim. I think there's really kind of a two-folded approach. You want to look at this when it comes to public funding. You know, looking at the funding cycle for the state of Pennsylvania, most of the funding programs that are available at the state level and also at the federal level that municipal governments, counties, authorities, and other private entities may be interested in are usually running on a cyclical process. So in other words, there are always going to be open at certain times of the year. And so it's really important for communities and for counties and these other private sector entities to be able to plan out for those time periods that are there for applications and decision making as it relates to the funding. So really working through a continuous process is really important. The other thing, especially for municipal governments right now, is we're getting ready to begin entering into the budget cycle for municipal governments, where they start to prepare for their 2021 budgets, thinking about funding that needs to be committed for feasibility studies on future projects, thinking about committing funding that may be required as part of the match requirements for some of the public funding opportunities. That's the type of things that need to be thought of right now and start in that thought process, start to thinking about right now so that they're adequately prepared to be able to access some of this funding. It's important to note that as you look at this graph, that a lot of this funding that's available, it really does not position one very well if they wait till the programs are open. So looking at the program funding that may be available in the first quarter of a year waiting until January to start to prepare for that is really not a good practice. It'd be better looking at it right now and starting to prepare for it so that when the programs are open, the entities that would be applying for it are ready to be able to prepare the required applications and supporting documentation for submission. However, the second part of this is the historic pandemic that we're in right now. Really thinking about what the impacts of this pandemic are going to be critical and critically important. There is funding that's going to become available to be able to help offset some of that, but there's also going to be a tremendous amount of funding coming that will help to stimulate the economy. We think back into the mid to late 2007, 2008, when President Obama issued his stimulus package to help strengthen the economy and recover for the financial disaster that we had then. The funding would come out and is looking for projects that are ready to be able to move within a very short period of time. And so for a community or a business to be thinking about what those projects are ahead of time is going to be critically important to be able to access this funding that's going to be coming out to help stimulate the economy and help to strengthen it after this disaster is over with. So I really think that the message is really being able to be prepared with a set of capital projects and priorities and understand what those projects are so that you're able to take advantage of the funding that's going to be coming. As I said, I really think that as you look at, we continue moving through this pandemic, there will be a point in time of a significant amount of funding that's going to be used to help stimulate the economy. And the entities that are ready to go and know what their projects are going to be able to capitalize on that. The ones that are not going to be able to capitalize on it. So it's really important to understand what those priorities are now and start preparing for accessing those funds.
John, I want to underscore something you said there because I think we are obviously in a unique time historically. You talked about the importance of planning in advance and being kind of first at the table when these opportunities do exist. Is there a difference during this potential crisis, this current crisis that we're in, versus previous time periods as it relates to the speed at which funding is becoming available?
Yeah, it's a good point, Jim. Definitely. Have worked with a lot of disasters over the last 10 years, and those disasters, the funding, maybe the best way to phrase it is it's measured by it coming out. So there are periods of times where they go through, where there's a process that has gone through to assess the damage, goes through a legislative process to be able to access or to create that funding and authorize it, and then that funding to be able to come out. And my experience has been that can take 6 months, a year to a year and a half to even further out before that funding may be available. What we're seeing and what I believe is going to occur with this disaster, and we've already seen it when you think about the payroll protection program and how fast that program came out and was distributed to businesses, or you think about how quickly the stimulus checks went into taxpayers' accounts and how fast that went. That is unprecedented. And I think that as you start to see the stimulus funding coming out where it may be directed towards business stabilization and infrastructure, you're going to see it coming out just as fast. So the communities and the other potential applicants for that funding need to really be ready because it's going to be coming very, very quickly.
That's a great segue to our next panelist, Jesse Suiters. Jesse, John was talking about the importance of being ready in this environment that we're in, and certainly that's true in a standard year as well. Why is the strategy for funding so important, and how do you plan for that?
Well, first, what I would say is there's two types of funding that we can talk about in this situation. There's disaster and recovery funding. And then there is your more typical, I should say, kind of annual revolving funding out there that occurs on the first, second, third, and fourth quarter, as is shown in the graphic. Both of those, though, have similar baseline consideration that needs to be made, and that is to develop a strategy to approach either of the sources of funding, and that is to understand holistically a community's challenges, what their desired outcomes are, and understanding the types of funding that are available that could be available in a disaster scenario, and understanding which ones of those are feasibly applicable to the community's desired goals and to the community's challenges. So the first step in the strategy is having that established, which is what Dawood planning does. We work with communities to establish those challenges, deficiencies, and desired outcomes so that we can then approach implementable projects using funding. And that funding occurs, as you see in the graphic here, kind of on a horizon. So if you kind of think about the curvature of the Earth, or if you've ever been in an airplane, you look out the window, you can see a certain distance before the horizon drops off. So oftentimes what clients see is a funding source kind of there. And so they go and they try to achieve that funding source, but there's always one on the other end of the horizon that's getting ready to rise up. And they can be codependent or interdependent in terms of how projects relate from one funding source to the next to achieve that continued funding. Larger projects may have a component of that project funded by one source, and then in the second quarter, another source comes up that can fund another component of that project. So more than just understanding that there's funding out there, it's understanding the interrelated intricacies of those funding sources. And what you will see in today's environment with COVID-19 and the reoccurring natural disasters even that are occurring with more frequency is that it's creating a more competitive environment. And creating a competitive environment means that more people understand they have deficiencies. They're seeing them. Parks and open space is one right now with COVID-19. They're being utilized heavily. People are realizing they maybe don't have enough of them, and they're looking for funding to achieve more. And so because of that, understanding how all these things are related and understanding your community's interests holistically are going to make you more competitive applicant, because the funders or the grantors of these funds are going to be looking to see not just how the funding tackles one problem in the community, it's looking to see how it improves the community as a whole. And if you can tie that into other funding sources, you're even more competitive. Now at Dawood, we kind of use this idea of a universe of disciplines. So in the graphic here, you'll see that we have public funding at the center of that universe, and we draw in on all the other disciplines within that solar system, so to speak. So we're pulling in, when we're going after grants, we're not just saying, hey, we can accomplish this thing, we can do these great things. What we're saying is, here's what we can do, here's how we can tackle this problem, and here are all the various integral components of solving that problem or addressing that challenge that we can draw in. And that could be anything from understanding the people of the place, what the community wants, understanding how the science, the environmental science works, what design professionals think, information technologies, and drawing that all in to create a very comprehensive grant package that will be, again, competitive and holistic in vision. So that's what I would say, when you're looking at a strategy, is pulling in all those integrated components.
Jesse, I want to elaborate on one thing that you mentioned. I think it's somewhat counterintuitive to certain parties when they're pursuing funding. You figure, okay, I've got a project and I have something that I think it will be eligible for from a funding perspective, and I pursue that, and perhaps I'm successful in gaining some dollars to support that project. Does that make you more or less likely to receive other sources of funding?
So what you're asking is, if I have a project and a specific problem I want to solve, and I go after a specific funding source and I solve that problem, is that impacting my ability to get funds in the future to do other things? As long as what you can do is, as long as you can say, hey, we got this funding and we solved this problem, and it created these other opportunities for us to connect the community to this thing that we achieved. So for instance, if one of your challenges is having more open space, so you get a grant, you create a park, and now you have this park, but now you have to get people there. So now you have a connectivity issue or a transportation bike ped issue with getting people from where they live, work, to where they can play. And so if you can tell that story, if you can identify how it's integrated into the region's comprehensive plan, let's say, how this opportunity you've created has created another opportunity to solve another challenge, you can tell a compelling story, and it actually makes you more competitive and it makes you look more progressive as a community.
That's an excellent point. I think there's some concern that, if you got one shot to sort of get some of this pot of money available to solve a problem, and that might keep you from other sources of funding. But you make a very important point about the continuum of involvement in a community to solve these issues. So thank you for that. So one of the things that we face at Dawood, and that we're able to support with other disciplines besides the planning element of what we do, is the actual mechanics, the engineering of a project that we work on. So I'd like to ask John Pasula from our civil engineering team a few questions about that. John, what are we seeing among our clients that are pursuing funding in relation to the permitting and design project in the current environment?
Well, Jim, I think it's very important to point out that you need to consider permitting and third parties during your planning process. Recently we had a project. It included a joint permit application from the Army Corps for stream and wetland disturbance. We had a driveway HOP from PennDOT, as well as a traffic study. And then there's the third party coordination. If you have to cross power poles, gas lines, or bring either of those to your site, each of these can take up to a year to work through. It's important to get out in front of that stuff. It goes back to something John said. You don't want to wait for the funding to actually be open. You need to have all your ducks in a row, so you can be ready to hit the ground running.
So that pre-planning is a critical importance, obviously, John. Are you seeing a change in the response time of regulatory bodies associated with the COVID crisis?
Well, I will say it varies. I think some of the entities have been able to work remotely and get things pushed along. I'd say one positive would be there's now more emphasis on electronic submissions, and that's just a way more efficient process. But some of the entities that we deal with have a lot of folks that aren't as comfortable working remotely, and we have had things get sent to other offices, and maybe it's sent something gets sent to a different office, it's in the mail, it's at the front door, and a week or two may go by without it getting looked at. So it's definitely something to consider as well.
That's great. A good segue for my question for each of you on the panel here. I'll stay with you, John Pasula, and ask, what do you see in terms of the future for planning of these types of projects, both near term and longer term?
Well, I think you're going to see more emphasis on the public-private partnerships. I think it's going to be important to leverage funds so you can maximize their value. And I think also, a lot of these funds, you're going to see some more emphasis on green infrastructure to deal with wet weather in the future as well.
Thanks, John. Jesse, we'll turn that question to you now. From your perspective, what do you think the current environment is going to look like here in the near term, and then some longer term issues that we may face?
Yeah, so near term, there is an increased realization among various governmental agencies and entities, whether that's state, local, regional, where they're going to realize their quote unquote deficiencies and challenges within their current planning systems and within their current physical infrastructure, whether that's transportation, open space, whether it's economics. And what that's going to lead to is an increase in competition for public funding. And so I think what you're going to see is that increased competition for public funding, the increased interest in some of these community-oriented projects. And I see, even though the federal government is putting out a lot of funding, I see public funding becoming increasingly more difficult to achieve in the competitive environment.
Great. And I'll turn it back to you, John Miserak, for some closing comments on our prepared questions here. What about your thoughts on the near-term and long-term future for public planning?
Well, Jim, I think that, much as John and Jesse have said, I do think that there's going to be more individuals and more entities looking for public funding. And so really making sure that the projects themselves are ready to go are going to be really critically important to be able to be highly competitive, and really thinking about projects that are holistic in nature and involve multiple components are going to be really important as we move forward. I think it's going to be yet to be seen as to what the impacts are going to be in regards to state revenues and where the funding is going to be available at the state level for these programs. However, there will be some level of programs that are coming out, and it will continue to come out that communities and private companies would be looking at that could potentially be leveraged for moving their projects forward. The state governments and the federal government is going to be looking to try to stimulate their collective economies. And so being able to inject funding into the economy to be able to help move specifically capital projects moving forward is going to be critically important. And so I think as we move forward here in the remaining half of 2020, we'll start to see that play out a little bit more. But I do believe, if you look at the current federal legislature is debating a $1.75 trillion infrastructure bill to be able to help to stimulate the economy. I think that you're going to start to see that move forward, and it will come out in maybe a different way that it has been proposed currently. But I do believe that there will be a bill that's going to pass that will allow for funding to be available for regional and local and county projects.
That's great, John. I think maybe I ask another question for you to elaborate on that too. So we've got these kind of competing factors. We have some discussion about some major federal stimulus to try to jumpstart the economy through this crisis. But we also have the standard channel of funding available where state and local entities have been grossly impacted on their own revenue streams. Do you think we're going to see some effects on rescheduling or delays associated with the standard cycle of funding?
I think you've seen that. Yeah, I do think so. And I think that I know that the Department of Community and Economic Development recently, and their Commonwealth Finance Authority recently revised their timelines for projects and grant funding that were supposed to be considered in the springtime and have moved those to later in the summer. So I do think that could be an issue that we need to deal with moving forward.
All right, great. Well, thank you all the panelists for your comments there. We're going to turn things to the Q&A session. We have a few that were submitted in advance, but I'd encourage anyone that's participating in the webinar now, if you have a question you'd like to add, use the Q&A box and put that in for chat, and we will publish those and go through each of them that you might provide. So I'll start with the first question we received in advance, and this would be probably best for you, John Miserak. Who should I be talking to from governmental agencies to prepare for this process?
Yeah, I think that being able to obtain the information regarding the available funding or the prospective available funding is going to be important. And there's a number of people that one could get in contact with to start that discussion. I think starting with at the state level, being able to talk to the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, maybe somebody that you would want to get in contact with to see how the federal government and specifically FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, may be able to provide funding for certain aspects of this disaster. The Department of Community and Economic Development, given the nature of this disaster being basically focused on not only health, but also on the economy, they are a good source of information and would be able to help assist in being able to identify certain funding sources that are out there. I also think that it's important to be looking and thinking locally. So being able to talk to your counties would be important. Recently, the Department of Community and Economic Development provided funding that came from the federal government to counties to be able to help offset some of the initial costs and some of the initial expenses related to the disaster. And so counties currently may have some funding available that would be important to be able to talk to for that. And I also think that the chambers of commerce and local economic development corporations are also a potential good resource for entities to be able to talk to see if there's any available funding. I know that where our corporate office is located here in Dauphin County, that a lot of times a lot of information has been disseminated through our regional Capital Region Economic Development, or CREDIC, organization for businesses and for communities as it relates to economic development recovery efforts. So all those organizations are really important. One other one at the federal level that I would just quickly mention too, because of the nature of this disaster, would be the Department of Commerce's Economic Development Administration. That would also be an important federal funding source that may be available for being able to offset any of the impacts that we see from this disaster.
All right, thanks, John. Next question I have is about eligible reimbursement expenses. So what costs will be eligible for disaster reimbursement in current funding?
In the current funding, you're looking at expenses that really have been incurred by the counties or local governments for being able to address the disaster. You're looking at eligible expenses such as the purchases of the personal protective equipment, or the PPE that you've heard. You may see some of the funding available to be able to offset behavioral health and substance abuse that has occurred, tourism and economic development, as well as you saw the payroll protection program come out and try to help assist small businesses and other businesses with being able to help keep them open and help some of their payroll challenges they may have during this disaster. So you're really looking at those types of programs for promoting economic development and really helping to sustain and kind of stop the hemorrhaging from an economic perspective of the regional economies, as well as being able to address the disaster itself and the health aspect of this disaster. Again, I think this is a little bit different than the previous disasters when you think about hurricanes and tornadoes and floods and fires and even volcanic eruptions that have occurred in the United States over the last 15 or 20 years and really have been the focal point of a lot of disaster recovery. This disaster is a little bit different than those disasters. And so as they move forward, there's going to be a need for maybe a little bit of an alternative approach to being able to provide that funding, because the needs are going to be a little bit different for this disaster. So it's really important. And the one thing that I would urge specifically all public entities is to really keep track of all the expenses that you've incurred and that you've made in regards to being able to fight this disaster. Documentation will be very, very important as you move forward, and being able to document that and understand what you have spent funding on to help respond to this will be important for your success.
Thanks, John. I think that's actually a good segue to the next question I got here, which is what does the team look like that's pursuing these sorts of projects? I guess I would add a little color to that myself to say that, typically speaking, when we're involved with a new project that might even be a public-private partnership like John Pasula was discussing, or even with a municipal entity of some size, that we often will have people from different disciplines, as Jesse was elaborating in the strategy of how we approach this, that might be big and small firms. They might be other diverse firms like Dawood, which is a minority-owned business enterprise. We might have other WB requirements for participation. If there are certain federal funds that are set aside for veteran-owned businesses, that's a common piece of that as well. But back to the original question there, feel free to chime in about what's this team approach look like, and who are those typical participants, both on the consultant side and also on the entity side?
I could start off with that, Jim. It's a good question in regards to what needs to be basically built so that you can develop good quality projects that could be attractive to public funding. I think that, as we've been talking a little bit about here, and Jesse and John talked a little bit about having professionals that can go through and look at feasibilities of the projects and understand whether or not what's being proposed can be built, understanding what those actual cost estimates are, understanding what the actual timelines are going to be for those projects, so that you are able to put forth a good, solid project that will be able to be implemented. If you do not include all of those, including the regulatory approvals, As Jesse said, if you put forth a project and you're unable to move that project forward, and you're not able to successfully utilize that funding, that sometimes can penalize somebody when they're looking for future funding. So being able to have projects that are feasible, that understand the true timelines, have accurate costs, will be ones that are looked upon favorably. So when you're looking at a good team, you're looking at really being able to have environmental regulatory approval individuals. You're looking at different types of disciplines from engineering. That would be critical to be a success there. Understanding the public funding process would be important for the team that's helping to prepare those. I will tell you that, in the current environment, a lot of the projects that are out there, you're looking at key stakeholders such as one, and quite frankly, if the project can be larger, the multiple municipal governments can always looks very good on a project. So a project that's going to impact multiple governments at multiple levels, having a county partnering with a couple municipalities to move projects forward is always really important. And if there's opportunities for job creation and working on projects where true public-private partnerships are there, where you're looking at working to develop a project that may also require some public improvements, in that public-private partnership between a private company and the municipal government or an authority to be able to move those projects forward are usually critical to success. So being able to go in solely by yourself is usually not the best recipe for success. It's really working to pull all those key stakeholders together, and goes back to maybe one of the initial things we talked about, which is to be able to build those partnerships and build those teams. It takes some time. So you cannot really wait until the application announcements are opened and you have 2-3 months to be able to prepare and submit those applications. You need to be thinking about this in advance so that you can have everybody ready to move forward.
And I would just add to, I want to add to what John was saying there is, in terms of the team, John has a very good list of the stakeholder, the technical stakeholders you need to bring to the table. A lot of these grants, and even more of them moving into the future, as I would see it, are going to be looking for community support as well. So a member of your team that is sometimes missed is community members and other key community stakeholders. A lot of these grants are looking for letters of support. They're looking for documentation that this project you're pursuing has been vetted in the public space and has been considered by the community as a whole. So your team, is bigger than just your technical staff. And one other thing that I would want to build on what John said is, a large part of what we do at Dawood is we are consistently monitoring these funding sources. We're consistently educating ourselves on what the intricacies of these are, and we're developing relationships to support those. So if there's an agency that's putting out funding, we're at their doorstep talking to them, making sure that we understand the ins and outs of what they're putting out there. So what I would say is that governmental agencies, as well as other firms, large or small, can capitalize on partnering with Dawood to use those connections to make applications for grants for their clients or solving their clients' problems more realistic or more feasible.
All right, thanks, Jesse. I appreciate that, and appreciate the commentary of all of our panel. We're coming up here on the half hour, and we want to make sure we are respectful of everyone's time that's participated. But we do want to share with you our contact information if there are things that you wanted to ask but didn't want to ask in the open forum, so that you can reach out and talk to us individually. You can reach out to any member of the panel or myself. Our email addresses are on screen now. You can also simply contact us at info@dawood.cc, and we'll make sure that gets routed to the appropriate professional to assist you with your question. I want to thank everyone for participating, especially my colleagues on the panel today in this, our second seminar. We have 3 upcoming additional seminars in our summer webinar series. Our next one is about 2 weeks away. We'll be talking about enhanced GIS data collection for the use of asset management. Some of that information is very valuable in these types of projects so that you know the current state of the assets that you're trying to improve. We will also be talking about ADA compliant design in a future webinar, and then our final one will be about GIS mapping in municipalities. So we've got a really good suite of instructional sessions here showcasing some of the projects that we're working on and the ways that we can assist you in pursuing those projects. So encourage you to join us, and please, if you liked what you heard today, you can share the recording, reach out to us. We'll be glad to provide a link to someone that wasn't able to join today so that they can share this information as well. We appreciate all of you being with us today, and on behalf of all my colleagues here at Dawood Engineering, we wish you to be safe and well, and thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon.